Shocking stories from soldiers and drone operators by Wartime Stories. You good, YouTube?
Of all the nations known throughout recorded history, there aren't many that hold the proud distinction of having never been conquered or colonized by invading forces. Afghanistan is one of these select few countries. Alexander the Great, the Persians, the Mongols, the British Empire, and the recent hegemon of the Soviet Union have all attempted to subdue this Middle Eastern nation. All have failed, thus cementing Afghanistan's place in history as the graveyard of empires. But what is the secret behind the country's enduring resistance against the invading forces of foreign, often more powerful armies? Many strategists will cite the Afghan terrain as being the key to its success, namely its vast mountain ranges. Their vast network of uncharted footpaths, valleys, overlooks, and cave systems have proven effective in concealing even entire armies from the eyes of their enemies. In more recent years, the British, Australian, Canadian, and American troops tasked with rooting out insurgents from within this imposing landscape have no less faced an overwhelming task. There are some among these men, however, who found the task all the more unnerving.
You know, I actually always forget about Soviet operations that happened in Afghanistan. Like, that's one of those that I've heard tangentially about, but I always forget that it actually happened and that the Soviet Union was in the area. Was it the 70s or the 90s? I don't remember. But the Soviets were definitely in the area. I always forget that's a piece of history.
While exploring these mountains on foot, flying unmanned aerial vehicles overhead, and interviewing local villagers, these men realized that the mountains of Afghanistan harbor far more than rebel insurgents. They describe witnessing creatures that have long been believed to be extinct, if not complete myths. This is the Smoke Pit, and these are true stories from military servicemen of giants in Afghanistan.
Well, I mean, of course, allegedly, nothing that anyone can either confirm nor deny, right?
You want to know what my theory...
Whoa! Sorry. Wow, we're in the cave.
You want to know what my theory is as to why the giants remain living in secluded areas? It's because you can't get spam calls and texts in the mountains of Afghanistan.
You know, he has a good point, actually. Hold up. Let him cook. I think he's onto something.
Why is it that every time my phone rings now, instead of actually answering it, I start Googling the number to see who's calling me? And, oh, look, I've got another text message. What's this? An undelivered package notification sent from a sketchy email.
Oh, I've been getting a bunch of these recently. I just ignore each and every one of them. I actually had a situation recently where I ordered from a seller on TCG Player. It was like 16 Mind Control or something for Yu-Gi-Oh! But I had to actually wait for USPS to leave one of the pink slips on my door saying, hey, the sender didn't actually provide proper postage, to which I went down to the USPS office locally and I was just like, hey, I need to go pay this. I owe you guys some money. And it was cool. I don't answer these. I will wait for USPS or them to leave me an official slip, and then I will follow up with it.
Guess I'd better click on this super legit looking link to confirm my mailing address, right? And here's another one. How have you been? Well, random stranger, I'd be a lot better if you weren't spamming me every day with calls and text messages because some big data broker sold my information to you. This is so obnoxious. I've even tried changing my voicemail to a fax tone to get them to leave me alone. It's clear that these businesses happily collect our data but then do nothing to protect it, whether
Exactly.
selling it or exposing it to data breaches. That's why for some time now I've been using Aura, the sponsor of today's video. Even though my data, including my full social security number, was lost in the recent AT&T hack, and possibly now in the Ticketmaster hack that just happened, I'm not worried. Like the guy walking behind you in a patrol, Aura has my back.
Dude, we really need some regulations on some of this. I know people often shy away from the funny R word regulation, but good God, we need to start regulating some of this. Like, we need to start cracking down on data brokers and stuff. Like, it's getting ridiculous.
Always on, removing my info from data broker sites and alerting me when my data has been compromised. Look, I'm not leaving myself and my family vulnerable to any more data breaches.
No.
And if you don't want to either, you can go to aura.com/wartime stories and try your first 2 weeks for free. Also linked below in the description. You've got nothing to lose just by trying it out. Now, back to our story.
9 out of 10, leaning on 10 out of 10. The audio was great. I did like that it's a topic that I'm passionate about and have some understanding and knowledge of, right? I did like that. However, from a non-biased situation, audio was good. I was a little against the cave at first, but it was thematic. It was artistic and was in line with what he was trying to present. It did come back to the regular audio. I liked it. 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10. I'm somewhere in between. I'll probably lean at 9 out of 10, but I don't know how that ad could have been better. That was fantastic, though.
The Giant of Kandahar.
Oh yeah. This one's infamous. This one's a pretty common one to hear about. Allegedly happened.
Anybody else get that feeling?
What feeling?
That we're being watched?
Yeah, I was just about to say the same thing. Just keep your eyes peeled.
In the aftermath of the September 11th terrorist attacks, the United States military launched Operation Enduring Freedom, which began in October of 2001. Their goal was the dismantling of the Taliban regime that was harboring al-Qaeda terrorists, believed to be responsible for the attacks. This military action involved a large-scale deployment of U.S. forces into Afghanistan, leading to significant combat operations and the toppling of the Taliban government. Squaring off against overwhelming American air superiority, the Taliban forces soon fled the cities, finding refuge in the nation's many vast, rugged mountain ranges. These natural fortresses now serving as their home base, the insurgents then launched a fierce resistance against both the American troops and their Western allies. With the Kandahar region being identified as a key stronghold for the Taliban, securing the mountains was essential in disrupting their supply lines, their operations, and control. To accomplish this monumental task, the Americans would employ a search and destroy strategy. These missions involved ground troops, often special operations forces, such as the U.S. Army Rangers and Navy SEALs, conducting thorough searches of areas known or suspected to be occupied by the enemy. The operations often required clearing and securing large areas of terrain, sometimes involving house-to-house searches or patrolling through remote regions looking for caves.
I mean, like, I understand the village-type warfare, right? Breaching and clearing, you know, I understand that section of it, I guess. And it seems like we got some pretty big boots on the ground with the Navy SEALs and Army Rangers here. I don't quite know how you do an exposed area. So, like, for example, we were talking about OP Rock in a prior Mr. Ballin video, and how it is just this giant rock in the middle of nowhere, right? And it's used as an observation post, used by the Soviets, and, you know, it's used by the, I think it's the British military as well. But I mean, especially if you're going into a situation like this, let's just take this as, say, the geography of the area, right? Like, I don't even begin to know, and this is why, you know, people in the military who are paid far better than I am, this is, I don't even know how to begin to dissect trying to cover this much land, especially when, you know, out of any nook or cranny, like, there can be a cave, there can be a little hole, and someone could pop out with an RPG, or someone could pop out with, you know, AKs, right? Like, especially, you know, going up a mountain path like this, for all intents and purposes, aren't you exposed? Like, once again, these people have training and experience that far exceed, you know, my own, and even what I understand the training could be and could entail, right? And that's why these are the people, you know, on the ground doing these types of jobs. It's just wild to think about trying to cover such a large amount of area, especially open area. The job's got to get done by someone, right? But the method on how you do it fascinates me.
Search and destroy missions were usually coordinated with intelligence gathered from various sources, including reconnaissance flights, surveillance drones, and local informants. This intelligence helped identify likely enemy locations and optimize mission effectiveness. The mountainous terrain otherwise required adapting their tactics to deal with the high-altitude conditions and the challenging geography. Uniquely dangerous as these missions were, whether from the enemy's improvised explosive devices, IEDs, accidents and injuries, or direct engagements, It was no surprise that patrols often suffered casualties. However, sometime in early 2002, one of these patrols disappeared entirely. Alarmed at the prolonged period of radio silence, another Special Forces team was quickly inserted into the Kandahar Mountains to find the missing men and return with either their bodies or any remaining survivors. Far from what they might have expected, however, the true fate of the missing patrol would take them beyond anything they had been trained for.
Hold up. Looks like we got something here.
Oh, man. This is messed up.
Oh, Sarge, these are definitely our guys. But look at this gear. It's like he got ripped right off him.
Should we send up a sit rep now?
No, stay sharp. Whatever happened here, we might still be in the middle of it. Rifles up.
I do like the sound effects, like the walking away.
Patrolling the last known area where the previous team had been inserted, this second team soon stumbled across pieces of scattered military gear and shredded uniforms, which clearly belonged to the missing men. Puzzled by what appeared to be a macabre trail of breadcrumbs, they began following it, keeping their rifles at the ready, increasingly unsure of what to expect. Having worked their way up a steep mountain footpath, the men eventually found themselves standing in front of a series of large caves. But the caves were not what first caught their attention. Littering the ground in front of the cave entrances was what appeared to be piles of bones. Despite this unusually gruesome feature, their first thought was that this must be a part of a vast Taliban cave network. But before they had time to formulate their next plan of action, the Special Forces team was suddenly confronted with a far more terrifying reality. Emerging from one of the caves, its primal war cry echoing off the surrounding mountains, a giant man appeared, wielding a long wooden spear. Its head crowned with thick, untamed red hair, its body wrapped in animal skins, its teeth bared in a primitive challenge, it charged directly at the now stunned Americans. Before the men could even raise their rifles, the giant, massive spear in hand, had thrust the weapon through the torso of the nearest man, simultaneously lifting him off the ground, prompting the other men to let loose with a torrent of gunfire. After 30 seconds of sustained firing, the giant finally collapsed, bringing the harrowing ordeal to an abrupt end.
I mean, sustained fire from what I would assume is 5.56. I don't think they'd be 7.62, right? I don't know. I don't know what would be standard issue. I'm assuming it's 5.56. Just going on the assumption that it's 5.56. I mean, especially in quick succession like that. I mean, that's a lot of firepower focusing. The hell of a round.
Skinwalker 2, say again, line 5, over.
I say again, line 5, one letter, Alpha. Break. Sierra 1 is down. We need immediate medevac. Over.
Roger. Line 1 through line 5 is received. Lima Charlie. Break.
Not gonna believe this shit.
For line 6, interrogative.
Here it comes.
You said Tango was a what? Over.
Ah, damn it.
There it is.
Golf India Alpha November Tango. A very large man with a wooden spear. Over.
Told you.
Roger that. Wait 1, over.
Baffled and horrified by their encounter, the operators immediately radioed back to their command, a transmission that arguably must have been the most insane situation report ever heard by the man sitting radio watch on the other end. Undoubtedly, it took time to clarify what they were trying to report, that one of their team members was now dead and that they had just killed his attacker, a literal giant. Once the report had been submitted, they remained on site, waiting for the arrival of the extraction team and marveling at the size of this creature. Taking measurements of the massive foul-smelling corpse, the giant was described as being at least 13 feet tall, and notably having 6 fingers on each hand, its gaping mouth showing 2 rows of teeth. The men also came to another horrifying realization about the piles of bones and military gear they had seen scattered around the area. It appeared they wouldn't be returning with any of the missing team's bodies. The giant had clearly eaten them. But they would soon find out that the giant's corpse was evidently of great interest to someone up the chain of command. After some time, a Chinook transport helicopter arrived, bringing with it loading pallets and harnessing gear. They were going to take the giant back with them. The return trip made all the more unbearable by the creature's awful stench. Upon arrival back at base, the men were immediately debriefed. After each man shared his account of the mission, namely the details of the climactic battle with a literal giant, they were made to sign non-disclosure agreements, forever swearing to secrecy regarding the encounter. This came as no surprise to the operators. They never saw the thing's body after departing the helicopter. They had no proof. Even if they wanted to tell someone about their incredible encounter, who on earth would believe them?
Exactly. Like, it's so outlandish of a claim, right? Oh, well, there was a literal 6-fingered, 2 rows of teeth, literal giant. Like who would believe that? If anything itself, it almost feels like it could serve as a misinformation campaign to try and discredit people that want to latch onto stuff like this. I mean, especially because there's no evidence. I wonder how many kits and stuff had, body cams and stuff on it. But even then, even if they had a camera recording this, even if they had body cams and stuff, right? Like, I'm sure all of that would be seized by their chain of command in some capacity, right? Like, at the end of the day, I mean, it's a cool story. Nothing that really can either be confirmed nor denied, right? I mean, I know this is perpetuated on the internet since, time immemorial. Well, at least in regards to, the internet, I guess. But it's just, it wouldn't surprise me if random things like this did exist, but also I temper that with a heavy dose of skepticism, strictly because all rational things need to be ruled out first. And that being said, I mean, if it comes down to, if this matter is going to be kept secret, there's nothing that I can do about it. And even then, even if there was somebody, because there could be someone who watches this or come across this and is like, was part of that unit. I mean, they can't say. They can neither confirm or deny any sort of creature. They can neither confirm or deny that any such creature was fought, any such creature was taken by said helicopter. And that's fine. I'm okay not knowing. I know a lot of people aren't okay not knowing, but it's definitely interesting to consider. Just if things like this do exist. Exactly. Did you see a giant? No, you didn't. What a good intro, though. What a good hook.
Since the story began making headlines in various military papers and other news sites in 2022, the Giant of Kandahar has since become a staple in the vast realm of cryptid lore.
Is it really 2022? I could have swore I heard about this before 2022. That's wild if not. So then I'm wrong. Okay, I'm misremembering how old this thing is, right? Because especially this happened in 2001. I don't know. It's like the whole U.S. government aliens thing, where people widely were just like, oh, aliens could exist. And then we had congressional hearings on it, and, me included, people were just like, oh, yeah, no, they don't exist. Fine. Nah.
But how did this incredible story first come to light? The earliest known record of the account surfaced in 2008, only about 6 years after the incident was said to have taken place. So much for keeping it a secret. However, the original testimony came not from any of the soldiers who reportedly killed the giant, but from the pilot of the CH-47 Chinook helicopter that transported its corpse out of the mountains. This pilot, who remained anonymous, was interviewed by George Norrie on the Coast to Coast AM program during a December 3, 2008 episode titled Flashpoints and Giants. Considering that he only witnessed the loading and transport of the giant's body, his own testimony includes very little about what had happened before the helicopter arrived to pick it up. His testimony was compelling in that he never sought to embellish the story by recounting a harrowing tale of a man being speared by the giant, followed by a dramatic firefight. The pilot simply explained only what he had personally witnessed and was forthcoming in stating that he heard most of what had happened secondhand from the soldiers who had killed the creature.
So would the pilot fall under Air Force? I actually don't know how that works, right? So if you're piloting a helicopter, piloting plane, I always assumed that you were part of the Air Force in some capacity, right? So if everyone on the ground was, either Navy or Army, right? Or even Marine Corps, right? And they had to sign NDAs and stuff. Army has their own pilots. Okay, thank you for the clarification on that. So he's probably, an Army pilot then? It'd be a little odd to not have the pilot sign an NDA. So I'm assuming if this is true, if this claimant is truly the pilot of this, and an event like this did potentially happen, we could be looking at potentially breached NDA here.
Again, like I said, it was secondhand. He said that when they got this thing, it had actually taken out the first crew that had found him, and they went in afterwards. And when they came up on this thing, supposedly, of course, secondhand, but the way they painted it out, yes, this guy was eating probably more than our guys with the killing fields that they more or less described. But they basically said that the thing ran like the wind, threw stones at the guys at a pretty good distance, so they said. And, of course, our weapons did take it out because I was looking at this dead thing. So most of it was covered up with the tarps and the rigging and stuff like that. And most of what we had to see, we were just goofing around with and seeing what we could see on this thing because it was a pretty large dude. Could not, poke it, measure it, or anything like that. I can tell you that its hands more or less looked kind of human, very dirty, except for the 6 fingers.
Okay.
Having already been covered by a large tarp and strapped to a 463L pallet, a standard aircraft loading pallet measuring 9 by 7 feet, the pilot otherwise had a clear view of the creature's hands and feet. Though he wasn't allowed to get close enough to get exact measurements, the pilot estimated that the feet, which were covered in some kind of canvas material, like rudimentary shoes, were at least 28 to 30 inches in length. Having been curled into a fetal position to fit onto the loading pallet, if it had been laid out, he remarked that the giant would have easily measured a staggering 12 feet in height, if not more. Charged with airlifting the thing out of the mountains, the pilot could at least accurately attest to how much it weighed.
What I can tell you is the weight of the thing. Basically, it was approximately 1,500 pounds when it was getting on the aircraft. Now, if you take away the pallet weight and all the rigging that we had to hold this thing down, we figured it was around 1,100 pounds.
When asked about what else he saw that was noteworthy, he said the fingers were pasty white in color, appearing Caucasian, which was surprising considering the dark complexion of the local people. But, he reasoned, this could have been attributed to the creature now being dead.
Yeah.
He also described the awful, musky, skunk-like odor coming from the thing, which he offhandedly said must have been intolerable for his loadmaster, who was riding with the body in the back of the Chinook as they returned to base. In closing, when asked about where the giant ended up, he said he wasn't sure, but got the impression it had been transloaded back to an Air Force base in Ohio.
Always Ohio, dude. What is with Ohio? Maybe it's because weird stuff happens in Ohio all the time. That it's just like the shield of weirdness, right? So the shield of weirdness just protects this thing. Maybe I have to question, right? Obviously, if we had, say, some admittance, some video evidence, right, like actual hard evidence that something like this, the Kandahar giant, did exist, right? Obviously, this could be potentially a situation in which many people would panic. People would maybe throw themselves at danger unnecessarily. So I'm trying to find a reason and rationale for why, if the situation was true, why it would be covered up, right? And I guess to be fair, I mean, it did take out U.S. troops, right? And so maybe that could be seen as U.S. troops receiving as quote-unquote weak to enemy nations. There could be a number of angles I could approach this with. The question that I just have to ask is, we know that standard munitions take it out, right? Standard munitions, 5.56 specifically, were enough in a group to take it out, to neutralize the threat. So I guess why... obviously, I mean, right, I'm not trying to sow discord or anything in the ranks, probably, OPSECing stuff, putting things under NDAs. I don't know. It's odd to me. It's odd that, like, this just kind of effectively meme, just whisk it off way to a black site kind of happened. But I guess, I don't know. I guess Ohio, can we consider Ohio a black site at this point? Is that a thing? Like, the whole state of Ohio is just a government black site? That's satire. It's just interesting. It's not something that I will ever know, and it's not something that I feel will ever be declassified, right? If this allegedly did happen. So the reasoning and logic behind it do interest me.
Mention was then made in the interview of the fact that there is only one Air Force base in Ohio, referring to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
Okay.
And if that is the case, it only adds to the intrigue of the story and the likeliness for it to be buried by the U.S. government, because that base is notably involved with all manner of things strange and unexplained, such as the Air Force well-documented research into UFO sightings, which began in the 1950s.
There was a nice path, goat path. As we bent around this corner, you could see this opening of the cave. There was a cave as we're coming around. And then I see there's a lot of rocks, which is another oddity. And then bone matter, when I'm not close enough to identify what kind of bones, but I did see something I knew was a piece of our communications equipment. So instantly we're thinking ambush, maybe animal, could be anything. And there was enough room in front of this cave, but it had a sheer drop-off, but there was enough room that we actually got into a decent dispersal in case of an ambush. And he comes out. It was a man at least 12 to 15 feet in height. This is a monster. Red beard. His hair was long, past the shoulder, scarlet red, and he runs at us. Woke all of us into the reality. This is so real. We just went into complete muscle memory at that point.
This has to be a plant, right? This has to be some form of misinformation. I could see that being a valid angle to take this from, especially because chat's mentioning that this quote, this didn't definitely happen because of the way it was described, strictly because of non-conformation to SOP, standard operating procedure. I don't know enough about military standard operating procedures to really say one way or the other. What I can say is, if this did happen, this seems like this was a very sloppy job to cover it, so it wouldn't surprise me in some way, shape, or form if there was misinformation on something. If there was misinformation in some capacity at play here, maybe someone is a plant trying to spread certain misinformation. I don't know. Like, there's so much about this that, like, it just feels odd.
Considering the widespread account of the soldiers' encounter with the Kandahar Giant includes details not provided by the Air Force pilot in his 2008 interview, such as the Giant's red hair color, its double row of teeth, and the brutal killing of one of the soldiers with a spear, it begs the question, who provided this additional information on the story? In reading through various articles which have covered it, it was stated that in some circles, the truth of this giant story is widely considered to be an open secret among soldiers who served in Kandahar in 2002. But more precisely, in 2016, a video was uploaded to the internet that featured an interview with a man going by the name Mr. K, who claimed to be one of the operators on the search team who encountered the giant. The video has since been pulled down for unknown reasons. Perhaps because his testimony provided more details on the soldier's actual violent encounter, his testimony has come to define the Giant of Kandahar story, introducing the concept of a spear-wielding beast with red hair and 2 rows of teeth that took the internet by storm. Of course, with such a shocking story making the rounds in recent years, and even being picked up by the Military Times and reputable news sources, Everybody wanted to know, is this story true? When confronted about the alleged incident, the U.S. Department of Defense, to nobody's great surprise, stated that they had no record or information about a Special Forces member being killed by a giant in Kandahar.
Ah, yes, the DoD. Classic.
This official denial, of course, didn't quell anyone's interest in the story. Quite the opposite. Now that the story has been brought to light and is being widely considered credible, even more service members across different nationalities have finally come forward to share their own testimonies about similar things they saw during their combat deployments. Fascinating as they are to read, the following accounts, several of which were submitted to the Tales from the Grid Square project, appear to indicate that the Kandahar giant was only one of many of his kind that still exist, hiding in the remote mountains of Afghanistan.
I mean, it's interesting to think about. It's neat, right? Is it real? Is it not? I don't know. I think maybe there's aspects of this. Maybe there's like fragments of it that are real. Maybe some of it is also played up. Maybe there's also a misinformation, disinformation campaign somewhere in there. Heard the story when I was there in 2010, but it was specifically framed as a thing to be afraid of in the same way you fear Bigfoot during the nav training, to which, I mean, adds context to, hey, cool, it's the boogeyman, right? It's just your local cryptid, right? It's your Ohio frogman. It's your Idaho Loch Ness monster, so to speak, right? It's Bigfoot. It's the Mothman, even. I mean, it's entirely possible. And it could also, it could also have been born from just jokes, maybe, right? In jokes, stuff that maybe happened while on service, while on tour. One thing evolved into the other. It's like how you and your buddy talk about certain things, but so that third person gets involved, and then they say, oh yeah, no, these two people clearly love, I don't know, Battlefield over Call of Duty. And you're just like, what? How did you get that? We had a conversation about the two, but I don't know how you got to that conclusion. I've been a myth and legend since for the longest time. Exactly. I mean, it's a myth. It's a legend. That being said, it could be an experimental Taliban weapon. There could be a unit that wasn't supposed to be out there. We do have acknowledgements of things like Mac v. SOG, for instance. Not that I'm saying it's this level, this caliber, right? But I mean, there's a number of things that this could be used as a shield for certain operations. That being said, I'm obviously not military. I obviously don't have, understanding of how standard operating procedures would work for this. And I'm treating these all as allegations. I am not someone that will ever know. Let's put it that way.
The Giant of Kunar.
Hey, is that a new optic?
Yeah, Recon 3 or something. LT wanted me to test it out and then train everybody else.
How's it working?
Well, I'll put it this way. I am just pushing buttons and seeing what happens. Oh. Okay, I do see... Huh. Looks like we got a couple of tally just over there.
How many?
Oh, maybe 2? 3? It's just a big blob. It's hard to tell. It's like they're all huddled around. Oh.
What?
That can't... Hey, how tall would you say the trees are around here?
Huh?
The trees. How tall on average are the trees?
Oh, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 feet?
That's what I thought. This story comes from a soldier who was serving in northeastern Afghanistan several years after the original Kandahar story is said to have occurred. He was actually in country when the 2008 Coast to Coast interview about the Kandahar giant first aired. He writes, I was deployed as an infantry team leader with the Army in the Kunar province of Afghanistan from 2008 to 2009. One night, we set out on an observation patrol to overlook a village that we suspected IEDs, improvised explosive devices, were coming out of due to a successful IED recovery a few weeks prior. My lieutenant gave me a new thermal imaging system called the Recon 3 that none of us were familiar with, and told me to figure out what I could and pass along that information to the other team leaders. I started to look across the valley.
Is this actually a dedicated thermal imaging device? Like, is this just not a scope? Like, is this actually like Luke Skywalker Walker binocular status, like actual designated unit?
To what I could see, and that led me to look along the spur we were set in on, catching on a very large heat signature at the top of one of the false peaks. I did everything I could to get a clear image, suspecting that it was a group of Taliban huddled together around a light, as they tend to do in the mountains. All of a sudden, the heat signature stood up as one being. The trees in that area grew to about 10 to 12 feet tall, and this thing was at least as big, if not taller, than the trees that surrounded it. It started taking steps parallel to my position and was covering ground quickly with ease. Its stride was slow and relaxed, and yet it moved with incredible speed. That led me to believe this creature was gigantic. It very quickly traversed the landscape, and I lost sight of it along a neighboring spur. I couldn't believe what I saw initially, assuming I had imagined it. I never had seen anything like that in my life. I didn't tell many people about it, either when I was still in the army and even when I got out. I kept it to myself, thinking there was no way I saw what I saw. But then, in 2010, I listened to a story on Coast to Coast, specifically the story about the giant of Kandahar. That made all the memories of my time in service come flooding back and made me consider other things I saw during that deployment. For instance, the Kandahar creature was described as having fire orange red hair, and it reminded me of a tradition that the locals in the area of my sighting would do. The Afghanis would dye their hair a bright orange color, and even dye their goats the same color. They never gave any explanation why. It seemed like it was every once in a while they would do this, and then all of a sudden those orange-dyed goats would be gone.
I mean, that's interesting, actually. I mean, you'd have to... There would have to be a way to substantiate that, because that would actually add maybe potentially credibility to this account. I mean, especially if we're looking at this as a different situation from the Kandahar giant, right? I mean, this person, it depends if they reported their findings or not, right? Are they bound by NDA? Are they not bound by NDA? Are they bound by OPSEC? Maybe not. I don't know enough about that. I don't know how much about reporting stuff like this goes, if stuff like this is ever reported in a professional capacity. So, I mean, it would have to come down to, like mentioned, I mean, 15-foot trees in Afghanistan, I'm being told, are pretty rare. Doesn't surprise me, honestly. So, I mean, there'd have to be a number of things that could be substantiated, and I'm sure this could even fall into one of those like modern realism fiction kind of things, where, oh yeah, well no, this exact area absolutely has these things, but the account could be utter BS. There's really no way of independently verifying, right? I mean, short of going to Afghanistan and going on going on monster hunt, right? Even then, I mean, are you going to get far? Are you going to be able to, would someone like me even be able to make it to Afghanistan? Probably not. In fact, if I got over there, probably wouldn't be having a good time. So, I mean, it's interesting to consider. And I think that trying to back up and validate certain points within the story is kind of a double-edged sword, because one, it could help substantiate things, but two, can be backlash on anyone trying to even anonymously dismiss this or discuss this, right? Because then you have a better idea of where it's at. Obviously, it says what it was, Kandahar, I believe, right? Sorry, Kunar. Obviously, the location's a thing, but if this was, like, say, a true anonymous encounter, right? This could help actually isolate where such situations happen.
And the locals' hair would also no longer be dyed orange. I assumed maybe it was a cultural thing. I didn't understand, but now it makes me wonder if that was some kind of gesture to the creature, or if the goats were being sacrificed to it. I am a Christian, and the Bible briefly discusses beings called the Nephilim. I think that's what I saw.
I'm going to be honest, I have no concept of it. I haven't researched the concept of a Nephilim. All I can remember is Seth Zintalk's videos, Breeders of Nephilim. That's the entire concept I have. Even then, I don't remember. My education on that is so lacking.
A member of an ancient race of giants.
Cool. Seems neat.
Although he mentions the interview with the Air Force pilot being what reminded him of his own experience, it should be reiterated that the 2008 coast-to-coast broadcast did not provide any details about the giant having red hair. Those came about in 2016. It's possible that almost a decade on, considering Mr. K's interview and everything else that's been said about the Kandahar giant story since it first aired, the detail about the red hair got mixed up in the overall narrative, hence why this soldier thought he heard about it from the Chinook pilot. But it's no less interesting that he did find a correlation with the hair dyeing practice of the Afghani people in the region that seemingly validated the idea that the giant's hair could have been red, as Mr. K had indicated. If the giants are out there, even today, preying on humans, as the Kandahar story ominously indicates, he otherwise may not have been at all wrong to reason that the villagers would make efforts to appease the giants by dyeing their hair and making sacrificial offerings of red-haired goats. But far from all of them being cave-dwelling monsters, this next account depicts the giants as being much more human in their way of life.
I mean, how do you even begin to try to dissect something like that? Well, even that, like, how do you prove or disprove even that it exists or doesn't exist? Like, outside of going really into the country, which, you know, as far as I'm aware, isn't exactly the easiest thing to do, especially in modernity, right? Like, I mean, I don't know. This feels like one of those things that you could actually make. What is it, like how there's Oak Island series, right? You could probably have entire reality shows on this, or entire like mystery shows, right, on like sci-fi or something like that on a subject like this. It's interesting. Like, it wouldn't surprise me. It would not surprise me if, being in other places in the world, people in the military from, you know, not just the US, right? Say British military, especially if you work in intelligence or something like that, right? It wouldn't surprise me if you find really odd and weird things throughout the world. Are they necessarily things like the giants? Maybe not really. But it wouldn't surprise me if certain things had to be redacted. That should not be taken as, oh, I absolutely believe there are certain things that I would argue I'm a man of science, right? I like seeing things. I like seeing facts and figures. I like seeing anything that can be proven or disproven, right? Especially if it's from someone of authority, like in a position of science, and they say, oh, X is true, right? Okay, cool. But if presented with the other information and it's not easily dismissed, right? That's just kind of how my brain works. It's cool to think about and theorize about, and I have no doubt that there's odd things that happen in the military that people cannot discuss for relevant reasons. But, I mean, I don't know. It's interesting. Like, there's got to be a reporting system for this. There's got to be, if these events actually happen, there has to be some sort of, I guess, cognizance in some capacity on the subject.
Giants on the Reaper feed.
Reaper Actual, this is Raptor 1 Tag 1. We've reached grid 267-834, observing multiple individuals around a campfire requesting ISR sweep. Over. Copy, Raptor 1 Tag 1. Maintain current position. Confirm visual on civilians or possible hostiles. Over. Reaper Actual, Raptor 1 Tag 2. Visual confirms 8 individuals, possibly Afghani civilians. No visible weapons.
This next story was shared by an Air Force veteran who served in Afghanistan as a UAV, or unmanned aerial vehicle, operator. He is absolutely certain of the existence of these beings because what he saw was unmistakable. He writes, I was a senior operator on the Reaper. Heading up to work, a tasking in the northern parts of the country, I was scanning around, doing my thing, and looking at stuff. There are small villages up high in the central mountains that I've scanned probably a dozen times. I found a super small mud hut, which is where I saw the giants. They were 3-ish, maybe even 4 meters tall. There's a ruler tool on the screen that tells you how wide your crosshair is, and these people were as tall as the crosshair was wide. They didn't do anything crazy, just normal people things, tending fires and other chores. I wish I could say they did something exciting, but really they just moped around their small clearing. There were a few goats tied up, and a fire that one of them was tending. Hard to tell details, but they seemed to wear rugged clothing, I would guess similar to Afghan traditional garb from how they moved, but they seemed heavily cloaked. The only interesting thing was their size. The goats looked like cats next to them. This was all in midwave IR, infrared, at night, so they showed up as black, humanoid heat signatures. I wish I could have used our daytime camera. I always wondered if they had red hair. I was only able to monitor them for like 10 minutes before we were too far away to see.
I mean, I'm assuming something like that gets reported, right? Like, I don't even know how the report would have to go. A thermal video, that's a big thing. I don't know. Like, that's outside of my expertise to really even comment on. I mean, it's interesting that we have so many different accounts of these things, but I mean, it comes down to, is this just Afghani Bigfoot or not, right? Like, does this come down to this is just the cryptid, the boogie cryptid, right? Something that I could see being a thing, or at least the mentality being had. Verification would be really hard, in my opinion.
The giant of Korengal. Being a drone operator with eyes high above the terrain would of course be an ideal way to see a lot more than the average soldier on the ground possibly could. That applies to spotting both enemy soldiers and whatever else is out there. But when it comes to gathering intel using drones, a lot of what is observed is recorded and then sent for more careful analysis. Full motion video, or FMV, analysts in Afghanistan played a crucial role in military operations, intelligence gathering, and surveillance. Their primary responsibility was to analyze live and recorded video feeds from various aerial surveillance platforms, such as drones and manned aircraft. This next account was shared by another Air Force veteran who was working as an intel analyst in Afghanistan sometime between 2012 and 2018. The video footage he was tasked with reviewing was recorded near the Korengal Valley in the Kunar province, which often served as a covert route for Taliban insurgents to funnel men and supplies over the border with Pakistan. It sounds like his primary goal in reviewing the footage was to determine patterns of life, basically getting an idea of what people living in the area, possibly enemy insurgents, were doing on a day-to-day basis. When they wake up, where they go, when they come back, if they carry weapons, what kind of weapons, etc. And this is typically done prior to committing any other operations in the area. Like,
I mean, it makes sense, right? Like, do they have 50 cal MGs, or do they have something like, AK-47s, standardized 7.62, right? Do they have small caliber munitions? Maybe we're looking at I don't know, some 9mm carbines and stuff. I mean, just that alone tells you, okay, is it going to be relevant to commit, vehicles and stuff there? Is it going to be relevant to have, I don't know, maybe give the Marine Corps a boombox with Barbie Girl and tell them, I need this area past tense in the next 24 hours, right? I mean, it just depends on the operation, right? I mean, like this intel is powerful. Intelligence in any capacity, learning what's going on, just not even like to learn weaknesses and stuff, but just like to have that understanding is so powerful in any situation.
Sending foot patrols through the villages and so on. However, this airman describes witnessing a far more unnerving sight. He writes, I was an FMV analyst from 2012 to 2018. We were doing a pre-op soak northeast of Korengal, getting patterns of life on damn near every warm body. We saw some dudes around a fire, which is completely normal, but watched to see if we could ID any weapons. After about 20 minutes, what we thought were two dudes huddled together under a blanket stood up. I mean, this guy made the rest of the dudes look like children in terms of height. He stood up and walked over to a mud hut that he had to bend way over to get inside. We were using infrared, IR, so I couldn't say if he was red-haired or not, but I just know that he was a big mother effer.
I mean, as chat was saying, like thermal can have issues with depth perception. I wonder. I'm looking at this, just a mockery of infrared, and I'm like, I don't even know how you begin to tell depth perception. I'm sure things like height, right, in relation to each other, such as one person, feeling shorter, right? But then again, how do you tell if somebody is standing in front of somebody or not, right? So if you're looking, dead on, right? Like, let's say the figure on the screen, right? Let's say that's just a regular sized person compared to my model, but this person is probably closer. Like, I don't know how that depth of field works when it comes to this technology.
At least 8 or 9 feet tall. It's worth noting from his observations, he indicated this particular giant was intermingling with local villagers. The people in Afghanistan and the surrounding regions have long been very tribal, adhering to their cultural differences. Perhaps the giants, not far from being human themselves, are similarly diverse, including their diets. Maybe not all of them are man-eaters. Of course, nothing is really known about these giants other than what has been scantily observed. But as far as their coexistence with humans is concerned, and as one of these men indicated in his testimony, giants have been documented as far back as at least 5,000 or 6,000 years. A giant named Goliath fought with the Philistine army, and he was their most fearsome soldier, standing nearly 10 feet tall and carrying a bronze spear with a tip that weighed nearly 15 pounds by itself. Just the tip of the spear. By comparison, your standard fully loaded military rifle weighs half of that. Far from Goliath being the only giant, the annals of King David from 3,000 years ago would indicate there were other remnants of an ancient giant race that he and his men fought and killed in later battles, along with those accounted for much earlier by Moses and Joshua. They are often called the Rephaites or Rephaim, being descendants of a giant named Rapha. Another of them was killed by King David's brother, Jonathan, in a battle in Gath, Goliath's homeland. Like the giant of Kandahar, he was recorded in the second book of Samuel as being a huge man with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all. Like Goliath at the head of an army, one would expect that in any tribe, the leader would often be the biggest, meanest, and strongest one in the group. That might explain why a giant named Og was made king over the region of Bashan, northwest of the Sea of Galilee in modern-day Syria. How do we know he was a giant? He was cited by Joshua as being one of the last of the Rephaites. The third book of Deuteronomy records him having an iron bedstead, presumably because he needed something stronger than wood. A bed which measured 13 feet in length by 6 feet in width. It doesn't sound like he would have slept comfortably on a small army cot. Giants ruling over humans, fighting alongside them millennia ago, and now, in even the last 2 decades, we hear tell of giants warming themselves by the fire with Afghani locals. This next account would likewise indicate that giants are still out there in remote areas, intermingling with humans to this day.
It wouldn't surprise me, but in any way, shape, or form, it would not surprise me if something like this did exist out there. I don't know. It's hard to. What interests me is separating, fact from fiction, right? Religion versus reality, right? It interests me wherein lies the truth, whether there is a grain of truth, whether there's a nugget in there, or whether the entirety of it is true. You just don't know. I'm still referring to the giant situation here in the video, right? So, I mean, what's interesting that spears just work, okay? As someone that does SEA and fights spears just work. I hate fighting spears. Dude, they are so efficient at what they do. Like, it's actually kind of wild. There's a reason that it's been used for thousands of years. The stories are interesting. Especially if there's a society of these giants. But even the thing that comes to mind as well is could this just be a tight-knit community or communities of genetic malformities, I guess is the word I'll use. Because we have polydactylism in cats and stuff, right? Where cats can be, have 6, maybe even 7 potential claws on a paw, right? I mean, polydactylism exists. So, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if there was some genetic cause for not only red hair, but also for confirmed or at least mostly polydactylism, right? It wouldn't surprise me if there's some kind of genetic factor in there. And then you just go up, the evolutionary tree a little bit, and you can find where everything kind of spawns from. 6'3", definitely called him a giant. It's also fair. I mean, giant is also subjective to people. I'm a giant to some people. I'm only 5'11", right? But then again, I mean, there's people who are like, who have like super male syndrome, like 7-8 feet, right? We've had people breach, I think, 10 feet. It has to do, I think, specifically that has to do with, I think, chromosomes. Was it super male? I think is XYY. I'd have to double check on it, but like, I don't know. It doesn't have to be a not human Nephilim entity. It could be a number of things going on there, but I mean, we ultimately at the end of the day just don't know.
The Giant of Uruzgan.
Hi, Dave.
Yeah.
Got anything with caffeine in it? I think I'm losing my marbles out here. I'm seeing things.
What's that, Lieutenant? You seeing insurgents?
No, it's never mind. Just, I must be knackered.
On it, mate. Hang tight.
This next account was shared by an Australian officer serving in the central region of Afghanistan, possibly with either the Mentoring Task Force or the Special Operations Task Force, based on the context he provides. In his story, we find him sitting up on his LAV, light armored vehicle, late at night, keeping an eye out for enemy insurgents. Like the previous soldier's observations through night optics, as with most of the other testimonies, I am no less struck by the general matter-of-fact tone this man takes when sharing his incredible story. Something the Air Force pilot who was interviewed on the Coast to Coast AM program more or less stated: even if you have never believed in something like giants, when you suddenly find yourself looking at one, you can't really do much else but just accept the facts. The Australian officer writes, I was an LT in the Australian Army at the time and deployed to the Uruzgan province. I was on picket, what you Yanks would call security or sentry, in my LAV in the early hours one morning.
Which you Yanks. I love it. I love it. It's perfect. It's everything I've ever needed. Thank you, Australian military.
And was scanning across the valley with the thermal imager. That was when I saw a large, human-like figure that looked different from normal because it didn't have the usual clothes the Afghans would wear. It looked like a person, but lankier. Not much detail through the thermal imager and due to distance. It walked behind a few compounds, and I could see it from the chest/armpits up. I lazed the compound walls to confirm the distance a few times because I knew I would get a good return off the walls. I thought it was around 500 to 600 meters out, but when I did a more detailed scan, I realized it was further away. Using the LRF, the laser rangefinder, I was shocked to see it was actually at a distance of 1,800 meters. It wasn't in any hurry, and I followed it for about 5 minutes before it went out of my field of view. No idea what it was, but it would have been at least 12 feet tall. I don't know of anyone else who saw anything like it. Never told anyone about it before, but it has stayed with me over all these years. Of course, by now, we realize that he is not alone in seeing something like that. I get the feeling that these few accounts are not the only ones either. But of course, as each of these men has indicated, nobody wants to go around telling people that they saw what most would consider a fairy tale monster. So, like so many others, they keep it to themselves until someone takes a sincere interest in hearing their story.
I mean, like, it's one of those that, I mean, even in this video alone, right? How much of this am I trying to deconstruct? How much of this am I trying not to nitpick, really, right? But to take a look at and try to piece together what is reality, what is fact, what is fiction, right? And I think that's a big thing is like, something like this could even potentially, if these things are happening, be even under less security, because who's going to believe something like this, right? Something so out there, something so absolutely wild. I have the understanding that even if let's just say that these situations are all 100% fact and real, right? There's going to be some sort of NDA or OPSEC barrier that is going to prevent talk about the subject, right? Me not being in the situation and not being in the military, and I'm sure the military, if this did exist, potentially taking an interest in individuals who have, a 12 to 15 foot stature and can, with a single spear strike, absolutely gank a service member, right? I'm sure that, there's people who are going to take that information and run with it, so to speak. I have an interest in this, but I also try to, what sullies my own point of view is that I try to separate what is and isn't, right? I try to find the reality in there, not as things are what they appear. I mean, it's a big one too. We're told to state what we saw without adding any emotion to our reports. Some of you are correct and say everything as appears before you. And that being said, that also prompts the if these were happening, right? It wouldn't surprise me to have some sort of kill team or kill teams, right? Just strictly on a need to know basis, gathering odd intelligence like this, right? And then you send a highly trained unit out, and then they just take care of these problems right before they're even a problem. Whether they're Nephilim, whether there's giants, whether they're just genetically, there's some genetic markers that are just different to cause some kind of gigantism, right? Probably not a good, fun idea to think about, a bunch of insurgents, right? A bunch of Taliban being supported by an unknown number of giant individuals who, he takes several rounds of 5.56 just fine, right? So this stuff does interest me, especially from the military standpoint, because yes, you'd argue that I'm biased towards the military, right? At the end of the day, they do stuff that, people like me just can't and haven't done, and definitely deserve a lot of respect. But at the same time as well, it's that they kind of had that no BS approach, right? Like they're trained to deal with situations. And so you don't really hear about paranormal stories of, I saw this on our, on when I was stationed in the Navy, right? Not me, right? Using as an example, person stationed in the Navy and they saw a ghost on the ship, or maybe they saw one of their squad mates when their squad mate had passed away years prior, and they told them to get down, and because they ducked down, they avoided a grenade or a haphazard 50 cal round, right? There's stuff like that happens all the time. You can chalk it up maybe adrenaline, you can chalk it up to guilt, a number of things, right? It wouldn't surprise me if there were some of these reports, if they were made, or reports that were, okay, so I see this report. Now you're going to actually tell me what happened, wink, wink, right? And then I will accept the report. Wouldn't surprise me if there's a compilation of stuff like this throughout, the military or throughout the branches and stuff, even external militaries. Does that necessarily mean that, things have credence? I don't know. How do you necessarily quantify if a ship's haunted or not? How do you necessarily quantify that these giants exist without seeing them? I don't know. You just really don't. And it definitely will spook people off of trying to talk about it, because then you're seen as crazy, right? I mean, whether it's sleep deprivation, whether it's, one thing or the other. I mean, I don't think that counts as necessarily crazy. It could be a hit to your perception, right? But, being in an active war zone kind of hurts, from my understanding. Spam military NDA is 80 years unless declassified, right? And even then, I mean, there's stuff that's never going to be declassified, right? We talked about recently, right? The Kennedy files, those are never going to be declassified, right? I guess they're supposed to be in 200 years or something like that. I heard an off number once upon a time about that, but there's stuff that they don't have to declassify, or they could find a reason to keep it classified in the interest of national security or something. No, I think that the NDA would still perpetuate even after
Chechen
service.
fighters were giants. As if all these stories were not enough, just recently in late 2023, a journalist named Mike from Atlas News reached out to me to do an interview. When we finally spoke, I realized that he is also an Army combat veteran who served in both Iraq and Afghanistan. We had a long talk about all manner of the strange and unexplained with regard to military operations, bases, training grounds, religious texts, and so on. And about halfway through the conversation, we landed on the subject of cryptids, and Mike was quick to express his disbelief in many of these entities. But then he offhandedly told me about one unexplained experience that he had while patrolling in Afghanistan. In summary, he was on patrol near the eastern Afghan border with Pakistan, a region not far from where many of these aforementioned giants were seen. His unit's mission was what he directly referred to as HUMINT, or Human Intelligence Gathering, interviewing the local village leaders and trying to wean any intel they could give him about Taliban insurgents moving through the area. But during a conversation with one man, his interpreter explained that the man was trying to tell them to avoid going into the nearby mountains because there was a group of individuals living there that most of the villagers tried to avoid. Individuals, he said, that had pale skin, a habit of harassing the locals while they were feeding their goats in the highlands, and even throwing large rocks at them. Through his interpreter, and then showing his own rifle and the rifles of the men around him, Mike then asked if these pale-skinned individuals carried any kind of rifles or other weapons, and whether they were Taliban.
He was like, no, they're like you guys, like white, but they wear like clothes like us. In fact, they don't have like plate carriers. But I just remember the dude was like, yeah, they have like beards and they're like heavy set, and they're super tall like you guys. And so I didn't really put it down until later, and I asked about it. I was like, hey, did we get that base figured out? And they're like, yeah, it's nothing. Don't worry about it. But it was like this dude literally just told us the story of his life. I don't know, maybe it's a nomadic tally base, but it was just one of those weird things where it was like, why don't you tell us where these people live? And then years later, somebody talked about Afghan giants, and I was like, whatever. And then I thought about it, and I was like, well, the description matches up, and the kind of remote location matches up. And so after I discovered all this stuff, I'm looking back, and I'm like, I don't know. I chalk it up to it being just foreign fighters, Syrians, Chechens, or something, but that is sort of weird.
I mean, I agree with that. I mean, my brain's immediately jumping to some sort of foreign entity, right? Like white like you guys, but wearing clothes like us. I mean, depending on the era this was in, right? I mean, what stops it from being some sort of Soviet presence, right? What stops it being from some sort of like foreign presence, right? Maybe using Afghani clothing in order to disguise and camouflage themselves, right? To blend in with society, right? Especially tall like you guys, that feels less like giant status and more along the lines of like a enemy presence in the area, right? That the wording is very specific.
With the Kandahar giant being possibly the only direct confrontation between soldiers and a remnant species of giant men, at least in Afghanistan, it's understandable why this would appear nothing more than a modern-day spin on the David and Goliath story. But the fact there are other witnesses, all of whom relay grounded testimony, devoid of any theatrics, certainly this must lend some credibility to the continued existence of these creatures, even if the Kandahar story has been a bit embellished over the years. In any case, until further evidence finally surfaces which dispels our lingering unbelief, we are at least left to wonder. But these military men appear certain of what they saw. And as they say in the world, there is no smoke without fire.
Yeah. Someone that's a foot taller than you. No, absolutely. Like there's people that are inches taller than me, like 6'3", and I'm just like, God, giant. No, what you say makes sense.
Hey guys, thanks for sticking around here for the after action. I did offer a lot of feedback in the episode, but I would say after the fact that of all the strange and unexplained and bizarre, whether it's creature encounter or other mysteries that have yet to be fully explained, Giants seem to be the most straightforward and much easier to just accept. Because as indicated in this episode, you have, 7 different people reporting seeing something like this in Afghanistan. So it's very compelling, I find. If you guys, anybody out there wants to be the one to go out, explore the mountains of Afghanistan and report back to us, you let me know.
Oh, I do it,
but,
100%.
Until then, this is the most compelling evidence we have of their existence. That being said, thank you so much for watching, for listening, for checking out the podcast if you haven't already, and for everything that you guys do to support the channel. And especially, of course, thank you to both my patrons and YouTube channel members for your incredible support, and to everyone who supports the channel through purchasing merchandise or making donations. May God be with you no matter what you are dealing with, and I will see you in the next episode.
Oh, I do it 100%. Like, the biggest things are effectively just financial barriers. I mean, I would do it. I would go to F off places in the world and just do shit, right? I would 100% do stuff like that. But, financial barriers. 2, even political barriers, geopolitical events and groups, governments, right? There's barriers to do stuff like that. I hear Afghanistan is a very pretty nation. It's a very pretty country. That being said, it's definitely embroiled in turmoil, to say the least, from everything I understand. So I mean, I would do stuff like that 100%, even if it's just considered cryptid hunting and stuff. With that last story, I almost that would have to be reported, right, in some sort of channels, right? So if you're getting told that there are giants like you guys, kind of white like you guys, in our clothing, right? I feel like that's some report that gets made somewhere, right? Especially because it could be, there's really no, there's really no, like, backing for it, right? Like, there's no, this is hard evidence, but this is a rumor that's been around the area. This could be a potential, like they're mentioning Chechen fighters, Soviet cells, like, who knows, depending on the era. So, very outside of the bad areas. Yeah, that's also fair. But no, this is interesting. I actually hadn't delved into much. I knew about the Kandahar giant, but I didn't know about anything else in this. So this is a really cool way to kind of put all of these together. And I really, really enjoyed this. It's very easy for me to sit here, do a react video, and kind of critique things. But at the end of the day, people like Wartime Stories making stuff like this with the cast they do and put on amazing work. I definitely want to make sure they get recognition. So I do have in the description down below a link to the original video, as well as the original Wartime Stories channel. You should definitely go check it out. Absolutely. And I guess, what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on the situation? Do you think I'm being too dismissive? Do you think that I'm being a little too wanting things to be real? I'm curious what you guys think. In the comment section down below. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.